Okay, so in the last lecture, we talked about the first step of Kant's argument. You know, this idea that the goodwill is what's important. And we talked about Kant's argument, how he'll show, or he thinks he'll show, that these other things like pleasure in the absence of pain, happiness as the utilitarian defines it, how they depend on the goodwill in a certain way, right? Happiness only good if the person has a goodwill. Happiness from bad sources, not good. Happiness if the person has a bad will and doesn't deserve it, also not good. Skills like intelligence, charm, something like that, Kant would say, well, those can be misused. Those are only good if the person has a good will and uses them in the right way. Then we get to traits of character. We might even say virtues. Well, Kant would say those are only good if you have a good will. Something like courage, if you have a bad will, it only makes you more able to put your bad will, your bad intentions into practice. Courage being good, like these other things, self-control being good, take another virtue, also depend on a good will. So what I want to talk about in this lecture is how Kant defines the goodwill. We might agree with Kant. We might be on board so far and think, well, okay, the goodwill is what's important. There's still the question of how to define it. Kant will say, well, the goodwill is one that acts from duty. It does the right thing because it's the right thing. And for Kant, that means it does what it does because there's a moral rule saying to do it. A good will is one that follows the moral rules because they are moral rules. Goodwill, I refrain from, say, stealing or lying to somebody because there is a moral rule against stealing or lying. It's my duty not to do that. That's a goodwill. If I don't say steal or lie because I might get caught, that is not a good will. Doesn't have the right motive. But so, when it gets to the goodwill, there are also some other possible alternate ways we might think of a goodwill that Kant is going to reject. Why in the world think that a goodwill is one that follows this motive of duty? Why define the goodwill as one that follows the right moral rules? Well, Kant has a few reasons for this, but let's see how, again, he rejects other candidates. So you might want to, once we've reached this importance of the goodwill, you might still want to bring in consequences. You might say, well, a goodwill is one that produces good consequences, produces happiness out there in the world, or some other good consequence. Someone like Mill will say that's the value of a goodwill, right? Are we just going to reach happiness being the important thing by another round? Well, Kant will say no. And one of the reasons that Kant thinks this, think back to the Le Guin piece. Think back to Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? In that case, Le Guin sets it up, and, so that I think a lot of us as readers will admire the people who leave, the people who refuse to be part of this injustice. And if we do, well, what do we admire here? Kant would say we admire the fact that these people have a good will. Now look, in the way that Le Guin sets the story up, they don't seem to have an effect on the city. The city is going to keep this poor child locked up whether they stay or not. They don't produce good consequences by leaving. If anything, they make themselves less happy. But Kant would say, we still think it's good, we still think it's admirable if they leave, that shows that the value we put on the goodwill can't be cashed out in terms of good consequences. The goodwill is something over and above consequences. Or let me give you a different story. And this is one Kant actually thinks of. He doesn't bring this up in the groundwork, but in his other famous work in ethics, the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant asks us to imagine someone. I think I brought this up before in the utilitarianism lectures. Imagine someone who lives in an awful, nasty dictatorship. He actually has Henry VIII of England in mind, but you can imagine some modern dictator like Kim Jong-un, right? And so imagine that the dictator or his lackeys come to you and they say, well, look, we want to get rid of this guy, but we want to make it look good, so we're going to have a show trial. We're going to convict him of treason. And you work with him. You know him pretty well. It would really help if you came and said he was a traitor. And you say back, it's like, well, but he's not a traitor. He's very loyal. I have no reason to think he's a traitor. And they say, yeah, well, you need to say he's a traitor, even if he's not, because, you know, if you don't say that, well, we're just going to find somebody who will say it. And, yeah, bad things are going to happen to you if you don't. So, he's going to die no matter what. Someone's going to say he's a traitor no matter what at the show trial. It's better for everybody if you just go and play along. Now, look, as Kant points out, none of us can really know what we would do in that case. But I think we would all say to somebody who said, no, you can do whatever you're going to do, but I refuse to play a part in murdering an innocent person. No matter what the consequences might be, Kant would say that many of us, Kant thinks all of us, but I at least say many of us, would find that admirable. It is good not to be a part of murdering an innocent person. But look, even if you refuse, the bad consequences are still going to happen. The state is still going to have its show trial. They're still going to murder this person. In fact, the consequences will be worse because if you don't lie, they'll murder you too. Nonetheless, Kant would say there is something good here, and we find something good about the person who refuses to take part in this, even if it doesn't bring about good consequences. That's why the goodwill, one of the reasons at least, the goodwill can't be defined in terms of the consequences it brings about. It's good even when it doesn't bring about good consequences. Now, as a matter of fact, Kant will say usually a goodwill brings about good consequences, but that is not what makes it good, because we still admire it, we still find it good, even when by some weird accident it doesn't bring about good consequences. Well, here's another candidate for the goodwill. What do you think someone who has a goodwill is someone who's a good person is like? Well, you might think that a goodwill is one that feels certain emotions and acts from those emotions, certain positive emotions. Sympathy, that's the one that Kant really talks about. Or you might say love of your fellow man, joy in the happiness of others. Why not define a goodwill in terms of one that feels and acts from these positive emotions rather than one that acts from duty? Look, think about certain religious traditions, right? Judaism and Christianity both really define the right thing to do in terms of loving your neighbor, right? You should love your neighbor, you should act from that love, right? It's in the Sermon on the Mount, it's in Leviticus as well. Buddhism will say something similar, right? Buddhism, you should feel compassion for other suffering creatures and act from that compassion. Kant's going to say, no, 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 no. Sorry, not love, not compassion, but duty. Well, why in the world say that? Why is Kant so sure it's duty and not feeling good, positive emotions like love or compassion and acting from them? Well, Kant says two things. Kant says that emotions, even good, and he would put the scare quotes around good, but even good, quote, or nice, again with scare quotes, emotions like compassion or love or sympathy, they're not rational. They're not rational, and because they're not rational, they can lead us wrong. Think about this, right? You know, if a policeman is supposed to do his duty, someone is speeding, driving recklessly, and he stops them, and it's a nice older person who reminds him of his dear old dad or his mom. And he's like, oh, I feel sorry for them. I feel compassion. I'm going to let them off. Well, think of what might happen. If this person still is out there driving recklessly, they might kill someone, right? Emotions might lead you wrong. Or, this is a sillier example, but whatever makes it clear. If you see somebody leaving a building and they're carrying a heavy package, and you're just like, oh, I feel sorry for him, I'm going to help. Well, that might be a very, very bad thing to do if this guy is, say, an art thief stealing a painting from the Chrysler Museum, right? You shouldn't help someone do that. Sympathy might lead you wrong. So Kant will say even nice emotions like sympathy, like love, compassion, they're not rational, and because they're not rational, they can lead you to do the wrong thing. Duty, on the other hand, Kant will think is rational and does not lead us wrong. We'll say more about that, whether Kant's right about it, but for the time being, I hope you can at least understand Kant's argument. The second part here, and this is really important, is that Kant says that our emotions are not under our control. Now, what Kant means by this is that, of course we can control whether we act on our emotions, right? If you are a mentally normal adult, you can control whether you act on an emotion no matter how strong it might be. But Kant will say you can't control the feeling of the emotion itself. I mean, think of it this way, right? I am going to guess if you drive in Hampton Roads, you can think of some time you have been incredibly angry at someone when you shouldn't be, right? They're just trying to get to work too, but they don't let you in or whatever, and you are irrationally enraged with this person. If that's not the case, you're a way better person than I am. And you might realize that the emotion isn't right. You might say, I shouldn't feel this way. And you can control whether you flip them off, blow your horn, do something crazy. But you can't just flip a switch and not feel that emotion anymore, right? Or let's take another example, right? My grandmother, when I was a kid, was just horrible at buying gifts. Terrible. And I knew she was on a fixed income. I knew she loved me. And I knew that I should be grateful for the gifts she gave me. I knew that I should be happy, right? But I remember just in one example, I think I was like 12 or 13, she gave me this shiny, poofy, weird coat with a fur collar. I have no idea why she bought this. Now, in my In my intermediate school, wearing this coat to school would be like having a giant flashing head sign over your head that says, "Please beat me up." I was not happy to get this coat. I was disappointed. I was annoyed. I was embarrassed for her. I was embarrassed for me. I knew that I should feel grateful, even as a snotty little 12 or 13-year-old. I couldn't feel grateful because I'm supposed to. The feeling of gratitude is not under my control. I can act grateful. I can be like, "Gee, thanks, Grandma. This is what I always wanted." Try a little harder than that, right? I can act grateful. I can thank her for it. I can certainly try not to express how disappointed I am to get this. I can't make myself feel grateful because I'm supposed to. Well, and for Kant, this is very important, right? The goodwill is supposed to be something we choose. And Kant will say we can only hold someone responsible for something they can control, right? To define it, to say that this is what makes a will good, well, we have to be able to hold the person responsible for it. And Kant will say you don't hold someone responsible for something if it's not in their control. Look, if I'm sleepwalking and I pull the fire alarm in a hotel, if I can really prove that I'm sleepwalking, no one would hold me responsible for it, right? I can't help it. In the same way, Kant will say if we can't control what we feel, we shouldn't hold people responsible for it. So, and in the same way, if you can't control it, not only should we not blame people for it, we shouldn't praise them either, right? If someone's brainwashed so that he can only, if we imagine this poor person brainwashed so that he always has to be nice to others and help out, well, we wouldn't think we'd feel pity for him, but we wouldn't think that that's any credit to him. He's not in control of it. The brainwashing makes him act the way he does. To blame or credit somebody with something, it has to be in their control. If it's not in their control, it can't be good or bad in the moral sense. And if it can't be good or bad in the moral sense, it can't be something that defines the goodwill. So Kant will say, well, we can't control our emotions, but you can control whether you act on them, right? Not only that, you can always control the principle you act on. If I see somebody who needs help, I can't make myself, if I'm late to work, if I have other stuff to do and this poor person's in trouble, they're injured, they're bleeding, I can't make myself happy to help out. But Kant would say what I can do is, I know that I have a duty to help. You should help others in these situations. I can act on my duty and do the right thing. Or if I find a wallet with $500 in it, I can't make myself love this other person so much that I just want to give the money back. On the other hand, I know that I have a duty to return someone's money in this case, and I can very well act on that duty. I can follow the moral rule, help others in trouble. I can follow the moral rule, return people's property to them, even though it might not be in my control how I feel about it. It is in my control whether or not to follow these moral rules, whether or not to do my duty. So let's look, now that we have this control principle and why it's important on the table, let's look at Kant's larger argument. Whatever makes the goodwill good must be something we can control. Now, I've been focusing on emotions, but think about consequences too. This is another reason Kant is going to say that consequences can't be what makes the good will good. We cannot completely control the consequences of our actions. Think of my example of the person who saves a child from drowning and the child turns out to be Hitler. Kant would say, this person still has a good will. He saved someone from drowning. What he can control is whether he saves the person from drowning. He can't control what this other person later decides to do. Or, imagine other cases. Imagine that, there is a child running after his ball, running into the road. I swerve to miss him and run into a parked car. Well, let's just imagine for some crazy reason that there's dynamite in the back of the parked car, right? Look, I'm not responsible. Maybe the car blows up. Let's imagine it doesn't kill me, but maybe it breaks everybody's window on the block, right? I can't control that consequence. It's not my fault that this person had explosives in his trunk for some weird reason. All I can control is what I did, right? I swerved to miss this child. We cannot fully control the consequences of our actions, so Kant thinks, it's the goodwill, it's the principles we act on that are important, not necessarily the consequences. Well, third premise of Kant's argument, we can't control what we feel. We can't flip a switch in our head to say, well, I feel this way or I don't. So that's not going to be something that we can use to define the goodwill either. So neither the consequences of our actions nor what we feel can be what makes the will good. However, we can control whether we do our duty, whether we follow moral principles because they are the right thing to do. So our conclusion, we should define the goodwill as one that does its duty. Now, this is Kant's argument. I just want to stop or finish with a few questions that will be important. A few questions that'll be really important when we get to virtue theory, but also I think just a few questions we should ask generally. Now look, so Kant would say when we have a good will, no one can fault us. If you have a good will, no one can blame you. No one can say that your actions are less than good. Remember, a good will, Kant thinks, is good in all cases. Well, think about some other results of this, some other things that would have to be true if this were true. When we have a good will, no one can fault us. Well, if the good will is good by definition, when one does their duty, then whatever we do, if the good will by definition is one that does its duty, then whenever we do our duty, we have a good will. So if we put premise 1 and 2 together, so if the goodwill is defined as one that does its duty, whenever we do our duty, no one can fault us. Is that true? If it's not, then we might think that Kant misses something when he defines the goodwill solely in terms of duty. And let me give you guys an example. And this will actually go back to the emotion and feeling thing. Because it does seem that maybe Kant leaves something out when he excludes emotions and feelings from the goodwill. Imagine that a father was talking to you and he said, well, look, I'm just going to admit to you, don't ever say this, but I just feel completely differently about my children. There's Jimmy Jr., and I love him. He's a great kid. I just look at him and my heart wells up inside. And then there's Bob, and I just don't like Bob. Nothing he ever did, but from the time he was born, I haven't liked him. I look at my one son, Jimmy Jr., and my goodness, just love and pride. It's like the sun breaks from the clouds and happy music plays. I look at Bob, though, and he just annoys me. I just do not like him. I know he's my kid, but I don't like him. And you say to this person, it's like, my goodness, that's really bad. Maybe you're not a good father. And he says, well, no, that's ridiculous. I have a good will because I've always done my duty as far as my children go. I go to Jimmy Jr.'s baseball games, and I cheer, and I root for him. I am going to pay for his college, but I go to Bob's stupid little soccer games too. I hate him. They bore me, but I'll clap when he scores a goal or does something. I don't feel it, but I know it's my duty to act like I do. And you know what? I don't want to pay for his college. I'd rather buy a car with that money, but I'm going to pay for it because it's my duty. I am doing my duty as a father, so I have a good will, and you can't fault me. Is that really true, though? Aren't we tempted to say there's something wrong with this guy because he doesn't feel the same way about his two children? Aren't we tempted to say that he's wronging his son Bob because he doesn't feel the right way? And if that's true, if you want to say that, well, then you seem not to agree with Kant that duty is all you need for a good will. You think there's something wrong with Jimmy Sr., and if there is, what is it, right? He's doing his duty. There has to be something else. Now look, maybe Kant's right about this, maybe Kant's wrong. I just want to say that there's a reason we might want to drag our feet a little bit. And this also will be important when we get to virtue theory. Final question to ask Kant: is it true that we can't control what we feel? Well, in one sense, Kant seems obviously right? In the moment when I got the terrible gift, I couldn't feel gratitude toward Grandma. In the moment when you are trying to merge to the interstate and someone won't let you over, you can't just flip a switch and be like, oh, he's just trying to get to work too, whatever, right? You're probably going to feel angry. But is it really true? And I think it might depend on what we mean by control. Think of this. If you said to me right now, I'll give you $1 million if you can run a mile in less than 8 minutes, I would just miss the money, right? It's not in my control, given the shape I'm in at present, whether I run an 8-minute mile. It's just not something I can do. But imagine you give me 6 months. Well, if you say right now, I'd say, well, that's not fair. It's not in my control whether I can do this. If you gave me 6 months, I could do it, right? I wouldn't like it, but I could probably get myself into the shape that I could run a mile in less than 8 minutes. Well, what's my point here? Well, you might say to Kant, you can't control what you feel in the moment any more than I could just suddenly choose to run an 8-minute mile. But isn't it possible that we control what we feel because we can make ourselves into a type of person who feels the right thing? In one very real sense, I am in control about whether I can run an 8-minute mile because I could make myself into the kind of person who could do that. So, and in that second sense of control, might our feelings, might our emotions not be in our control? Again, keep this in mind. I'm going to put it aside in the next lecture. We're going to put it aside for the moment and just get into how Kant defines duty. But I think this question is going to be very important when we get to Aristotle.